Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Shay, and today I'd like to talk about something that's been bothering me for the last year, really. If you were born anytime in the 80s or 90s or 2000s at this point, and you're tired of hearing people in the older generations complain about how lazy we are and how we would prefer to party and spend all of our time on social media rather than being loyal to a company and working hard and saving money and not buying Starbucks, then this video is for you. This is my story with the job market and how it did not serve me well. So I'm going to call this what really happened to us because everything I'm hearing out there is what everybody thinks happened to us. And I'm here to tell you what actually happened to us, aka the workforce being one of them. Now, I'm currently employed, but as a millennial, I spent the last few months overhearing older folks complain about the younger generation preferring to stay home and receive unemployment rather than go to work. Comments are made about the laziness of my generation and how we would prefer to party and receive government assistance than earn an honest living. I think people forget that what generation I belong to, and they have literally been insulting me to my face. They don't mean to, they're just frustrated and they're tired of working themselves. But instead of recognizing why they are stuck working until they keel over on the job, they would prefer to criticize those who actually choose life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness over the drudgery of lifelong loyalty to an employer who may or may not have their best interests at heart. So let me set the record straight, if I may. The first fallacy that we as millennials and surrounding generations were taught was that we needed to get a job, and soon we would be financially independent. We would be able to buy houses and raise families and save for retirement and etc., etc. But by the time I was born in 1985, I'm recognizing that this was already an outdated concept. There were already multiple families in that time period that literally could not achieve this, and yet we were continually taught that it was still attainable. Sure, I could work hard until I died, but the chances that dedication to hard work would ever guarantee me financial security was hilarious. So let me explain. I got a job in 2004, straight out of high school, making $7 an hour part-time at a local daycare. Eventually, I found a full-time job that would pay me $8 to commute 40 minutes one way, work 6 days a week, and handle customer service, which, as anyone who's ever worked in customer service knows, is generally pretty hellish. I was raised to be loyal and work hard, which I was, and I did. A couple of years later, the commute and horrible traffic were seriously affecting my mental state, and I had been offered another job at a bank. And so, with a great deal of guilt, I quit the job I had and went to the bank with half the commute and at $9 an hour. I was still living at home. I paid room and board of about $350 a month and commuted to work and came home. That's pretty much what I did. Life was rosy. My employer was actually pretty great. My coworkers were awesome. I still talk to some of them, and I really enjoyed the work. I'm kind of a computer person. I love technology. I love typing. I love it. Unfortunately, I worked in the mortgage department, and it was now September of 2008. So, of course, I got laid off with everybody else. I was then dumped into a collapsing job market with a bunch of other 20-somethings and also a lot of families that had had stable incomes for years and had managed to start their own homes, right? They had actually managed to get the loan, buy the house, raise the family halfway. So the generation right before me, but not that of my parents, right? And now they were facing homelessness and job loss and everything else, along with me, who had not even gotten to start building any kind of a legacy. So we were desperately fighting for any source of income, but supply could not meet the demand. There were just too many of us and not enough jobs. In the aftermath, we lost our family home, and so then I was set adrift into the increasingly expensive rental market while being unable to find work no matter what I did. So I used my credit cards to pay rent and buy groceries for myself and my brothers for about 6 months before I ran out. And then at that point, my credit was ruined and there was nothing else I could do. I had nothing left. So again, everyone seemed to have the same idea at once. So a bunch of us ended up saying, you know what, we're already broke. We can't find work, so we may as well sign up for more debt in an attempt to break into a less saturated job market. In my case, I chose cooking school. After all, everyone says that going to school can only increase your chances of job security, which is also supposedly equated with financial security, which is a load of hogwash. But we can get into that another time. I was very wrong. I don't regret cooking school, but I do wish I had understood the job market I was getting into. And I am a victim of loan fraud. I just didn't get any of it back. I'm hoping that the government decides to just cancel all that nonsense because it's stupid. We're like the only country on earth who is so rich that all of its inhabitants are poor and can't afford medical care or schooling, and also still can't afford to pay their own living expenses. That doesn't even make sense. Anyway, from day one, I was told by my chefs that you don't go into this career unless you love it, because benefits are rare, wages are terrible, it almost always ends in burnout, and it's generally soul killing, because if you love cooking, or whatever it is that you're doing for a job, if you love it, and then you go into that career, and then you work yourself to death in it, the chances that you're going to now hate cooking and or whatever your career was, pretty likely. There's a reason I didn't go into singing career, because I could have probably done music. I just didn't want that to kill my love of it, and it probably would have. So good for me. Anyway, so they were right, but I thought that I could figure it out because I love cooking and I'm very stubborn, and I figured that I could just push my way through it and be fine. And I love the rush of being on the line, of expediting, the teamwork, and the precision that you produce. It's awesome. It's a huge rush working on the line. It really is. But unfortunately, internships were very rare at that time, and the only one I could find was an unpaid one in Los Angeles, and I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. So I used my savings, all of my savings, to buy a plane ticket to fly to Los Angeles for this internship. I was putting everything I had on the line. I didn't have much savings. I had like $300 of savings. That's all I had managed to save. Oh, the whole time I was in school, I was on unemployment. I was on government loans, and I also was working in the library for as many hours as they would give me a week, trying to pay my bills and trying to just make it until I could get out of school and get a real job, literally. So anyway, I ended up in LA, where the costs are doubled and the wages are exactly the same. So, plus the internship was unpaid at first. After 2 days, the pastry chef that was supposed to be training me got sick and called out and then just never came back. I should have taken that as a warning sign, but I didn't. So, like a week later, considering the fact that I'd only had 2 days training, I had somehow managed to do the job enough that they asked me to stay on as the new pastry chef, and they hired me at $9 an hour, which I gratefully accepted, with all the responsibility that came with it. I moved all of my things. I flew back to Georgia. I packed everything that I could fit into my tiny Honda Civic and drove back to California within a week, because I was not going to lose this job that I had. And then I started work the very next Monday after getting in on Friday. I was living in a hostel, paying $25 a week for living expenses. They were accommodating me because I was coming from out of state. Generally, they don't allow you to stay there for any period of time unless you're from out of the country. Otherwise, they end up with all the homeless population, I guess. Anyway, so I'm living in a hostel and or my car on some nights because I don't have the money to pay for the hostel. And starting work at $9 an hour as a pastry chef in Los Angeles. I can't afford food. I can't afford clothes. I can't afford shoes. I can't even afford my car at this point. So it's not long before I had to call my bank and say, hey, look, I can't keep it. I can't pay it no matter how they tried to work with me. And so I parked it on a street, told them exactly where it was, and asked them to please come get it before the city did and impounded it. Anyway, that's another story. They were going to pay me $9 an hour. No one else was hiring anywhere that I could find. And even with no benefits and nothing else, I figured, hey, I got to give it a shot. So I did. I was desperate. I mean, I'd spent my savings going to California for an internship for a job that I wasn't sure of because there was nothing else. I was in my early 20s and there was nothing in the job market for us. There just was nothing. Because we had a bunch of people returning to the job market because of job loss. And you had a bunch of people losing their homes, which they were upside down in because of the housing collapse that should never have happened, but it did anyway. So I had been close to buying my first home while I was in the mortgage department, and I'm really glad that I didn't try to in the end because I would have just been one more person upside down in a mortgage that I couldn't afford. Anyway, here we come to a key point. For the entirety of the time that I have been a member of the American workforce, I have been chasing a dwindling job supply, which required college degrees but still paid $9 or less an hour. It should be noted that a college degree in no way increased my earning potential in this field or any of the other fields. I may as well have started as a dishwasher who didn't finish high school. In order to make ends meet, I subsequently acquired 2 more jobs alongside my demanding and exhausting job as a pastry chef, 6 days a week. I would wake up at 2 a.m. to go to my restaurant in Beverly Hills where I made 700 pita by hand, baked it off in a wood-fired oven, planned and made all the desserts, accepted morning deliveries, worked the breakfast rush, expedited, ran the oven station, and took the bus home at 11 a.m. I slept a couple of hours and then took the train to North Hollywood, where I had been able to secure a job being paid cash by a friend who was the pastry chef at that restaurant. I worked the dinner rush and was done just in time to travel to an obscure kitchen warehouse space on Sunset by about 1 a.m., helping a small business owner I had found on Craigslist who made and sold their own peanut brittle. I cooked and packaged brittle until it was time to head back to the restaurant for the pita process to begin again. Rinse and repeat. With all of these jobs and no sleep, I barely managed to afford a tiny studio apartment in Koreatown, which I shared with 2 roommates. I never bought groceries. The only food I ate was free leftovers from the restaurants I worked in. I had no insurance, and if I was ever sick, I had to keep working, and of course I couldn't afford medical care and had no insurance. Did I just say that? Yeah. I had no sick days, no vacation, no benefits. In less than a year, my body literally gave out. I've always been super tough, very resilient. I have never been physically incapacitated in my life. Never broken a bone, never sprained my back, never been incapable of doing something physically demanding for a job ever. And I woke up one morning and could not lift my arms, could not lift them. And I broke down. I started sobbing, and my roommate was like, "What's wrong?" And I said, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't. I don't know what to do. I can't get up. I can't move." So it should be noted that all the pita that I was making every single day for the last, 9-10 months, I was rolling it out by hand. I had been promised a sheeter by the owner, who, by the way, was a DICK. And I'm not saying that just because I was unhappy in the job. He literally was. He didn't understand restaurants. He constantly got in the way of his employees, insisted that we do things in a way that made no sense. And if he had had any idea how to work in a restaurant, he would have understood that it didn't make any sense. And it was all about the bottom line. At some point, he actually started demanding that we serve half of the amount of the food and charging twice as much. Not only did he want to reduce the amount, he wanted to charge twice as much. Like, as a business owner, that just doesn't make sense. You don't, especially in Beverly Hills, you don't piss off your clientele by expecting them to pay double and then also serving them less. And then we were working in an open kitchen, so guess who got all the crap? He's so exciting. Customer comes up with the plate, slaps it on the glass counter, and says, "This is not acceptable." And we're like, "I'm so sorry, sir. What can I do to help you?" What can we do to help him besides break policy? So you know what we did? We fed people exactly the amounts that they had been getting before. They were still getting charged double because we couldn't control it, but we could at least serve them more. So that's what we started doing. And of course, we still didn't get any credit for that from the customers. And of course, the owner was pissed off. So between a rock and a hard place, welcome to the food service industry. Anyway, All the dough was being rolled out by hand. I was cooking it off in a wood-fired oven. It was a very physically demanding job. And I was generally okay with it. But if I was going to be doing this every day, all day, I needed a sheeter. It was too much. And the restaurant was picking up steam. Somehow, in the middle of a recession, the Beverly Hills restaurant people, the people who could afford to eat in Beverly Hills, which wasn't anybody who worked there, were definitely spending a lot of money eating in the restaurant. And it was a brand new restaurant when I started there. And so demand was increasing and I couldn't hardly keep up because I was the one doing it all. And my chef would try to help out when he had time. I had coworkers who helped out constantly, but eventually it became just this tedious process. And even my coworkers were just like, they just didn't want to help anymore. And I was like, I get it. I never expected you to, but also I don't think I can keep doing this. It's too much. And they're like, yeah, it's too much. It's too much. So I was constantly promised a sheeter. They finally got me one like a month before I left. And I was out for one day. I took one day off to rest because they now had the sheeter and I didn't feel so guilty because I felt like they had a way to get by without my physically being there to roll out pita. And they broke it. They broke the sheeter. So when I came back the next day, there was no sheeter and it was back to doing everything by hand, and that was the end of that. So my coworkers were great. My chef was great. The owner sucked balls. It's just the reality of it. Anyway, I was also literally mixing piles of dough, lifting the batches over my head into the walk-in because the only place I could store my dough was literally on the top shelf, which is like this, and it's a tub, like a 20-pound tub, lifting over my head, and people would try to help me put it up there, and they would constantly tell me don't pull it down without asking for help. But in a restaurant there's not always time and there's not always somebody to help you. That's just how it is. Anyway, my arms were so tired they literally gave out. Like, it took me probably a year and a half to regain the strength in my arms. I would just rest them. I would rest them on my elbows. I would just rest them on the table. I was exhausted. Anyway, so I didn't want to admit weakness or defeat, so I kept pushing myself past the point of physical exhaustion until that woke up that morning and I couldn't do it anymore. And I had to call my chef and be like, I literally can't even turn a doorknob right now. I don't even know how to explain this. I feel crazy. I feel stupid even saying this out loud, but it's true. Also, nobody else knew how many jobs I was working or how exhausted I was, how little sleep I was getting. My coworkers always made sure that I was sent home with food. Like, they'd make me this giant burrito. Like, this is the one great thing about working in food services, that you're almost always working alongside a lot of Hispanic people. And like, they totally get food. They're like, you got to eat to keep your strength up. And so they would make shakes in the morning with strawberries, all the leftover fruit and stuff that was about to go bad anyway, and raw eggs and all of that. And they would ask if I wanted to partake, and I'm like, sure. So they'd bring me a big tall glass of it and I'd drink it down, even though I really have a struggle with raw eggs. And they'd make sure before I left that I had, hey, you going home? When are you going home? Are you going home now? Are you 5 minutes? Okay, wait, 5 minutes. And they would make me, the grill guy would make me, this giant burrito. And that's really all I ever ate in a single day, because by the time I got home, it would just take me so long to get home that by the time I got there, I would collapse and sleep until I got up and went to work at my other restaurant job. Anyway, it was a lot. They didn't know that I didn't eat anything else because I couldn't afford to buy anything else. So anyway, let me be clear. This is not a sob story. I am sharing my experience because I know without a doubt that it has to mirror some of my peers' stories. It has to. We've worked our fingers to the bone. We've got hungry. We've lived in hotels and hostels, in our cars, on the streets. We have tried. And for this, we're blamed for being lazy and dependent on government programs. One must raise the question: if staying home and receiving unemployment is more financially viable, and receiving this extra unemployment, which was it actually came up to, I think it was like $300 extra a week or a month or something. Anyway, I've lived on unemployment before. Remember back when I was in school? Unemployment doesn't cover your bills. Even back then it didn't. It certainly doesn't now. And it doesn't matter how many jobs you're looking for. unemployment doesn't cover your bills. And even with the pandemic boost, it was barely enough for people to actually pay their bills without freaking out and scrubbing toilets. Literally, that's all it was. So, if staying home and actually being able to cover your rent and your utilities and a few groceries without being extravagant in the least made more sense than going back to the job market and fighting for jobs in retail and food service that already have always sucked and already pay nothing, and in the middle of a pandemic where you might bring home the plague to your children. Yeah, staying home made more sense. I would have stayed home, but I worked through the whole pandemic, so it just didn't work that way for me. But I would have, yeah, absolutely. And yet I would have probably been labeled lazy. And if you know what they need to do, they need to cut off the unemployment benefits, the extra benefits, because that's people are just being lazy. They just don't want to go back to work because they're just living the high life. No, they're not living the high life. Let me tell you, they are just literally finally paying their bills without being absolutely exhausted every single day and never seeing their family. That's all. That's my take. I could be wrong, but I've lived this life. I'm pretty dang sure I can tell you. So, maybe this is a symptom of a broken system, not a lazy generation. This is what I thought in my head while everyone around me was complaining that my peers did not go out and find more jobs during a pandemic. As long as they could, they were going to survive some other way. And I would have done the same thing. So, pandemic-specific unemployment benefits were eventually removed or reduced. And still, many people didn't go back to work. Surprise, surprise. There's a bigger problem here, you guys. The workers have been at a disadvantage for the past, I don't know, since the 60s. It's a long time. That's like when my parents were born. All the way back to then. We've been living in a world where wages have remained stagnant and prices have continued to increase. How are we supposed to manage that? We're just supposed to suck it up and, well, live out of our cars, really, or live on the street. You want to know why there's such huge tent cities? Anyway, I digress. Everyone was in shock and couldn't understand how the obvious solution of removing the benefits hadn't worked. And I'm sitting here like, I've been telling you guys, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because that's not the problem. The workers hadn't been forced into going back out and signing contracts with companies who laid them off at the beginning of the pandemic because the bottom line made more sense. I get it. It's business. You got to do what you got to do. But don't be surprised when your underpaid, unappreciated workers don't want to come back. They didn't go back to retail or food service in droves because, honestly, the only reason we go into those jobs is because that's entry level and that's all we can find. They say out there that they have plenty of jobs open and no one's applying. Oh, we're applying. You guys aren't answering. You got all these fancy algorithms that are literally shutting everybody out. I don't even know what's going on, but I know there's people applying, and I also know that none of you are actually hiring any of the people that are applying. So there's something else broken there too. I don't even know what. But I also know that I wouldn't go back into retail or food service if you paid me. Literally. I mean, they always say they're going to pay you, but they really don't. They really don't. I mean, I was so excited to get a job paying $13 an hour in food service. Before that, I was making $11, and that was only a year ago. $11 was not livable on my own. I was straight out of a divorce. There's no way I could have afforded my own place on that. I would have had to be with roommates. I would have had to move back home. People say, well, you know, if these people would just work harder and not buy Starbucks, you know, they could afford their own place. They wouldn't have to have roommates like college students or move back home like losers. No, that's an old idea. Just because people have moved back home doesn't mean they're losers. Just because people have roommates doesn't mean that they're lazy. What it means is that it's the only way that we've ever been able to survive or afford living anywhere. That's literally the truth. And it has been at least for the past 15 years that I've been around. People didn't want to go back to retail. They didn't want to go back to food service, to be verbally abused by the public, aka the Karens. But honestly, haven't you noticed that retail and food service, customer service has gotten so much worse? People have gotten very much less more, the people have gotten very impatient. Very impatient. If people were ever impatient, they're even worse. It's like the whole world is turning into Karens. But unfortunately, most of us have to, because guess what? The majority of the job market is in the United States. The majority of it is retail, food service, and customer service. That's what we do. We service the consumers in this country because all we do is consume. This country barely produces anything anymore. We mostly just consume. So if there's any jobs created, it's almost always in a sector that doesn't make sense or doesn't matter in the long run. We've created 5,000 jobs. Yeah, were they all fast food? We shouldn't raise the minimum wage. That's not right. Why not? Most of the people objecting to the raise in the minimum wage are people that have been around for 40 years and honestly should not object to it at all. They should be glad that they want to raise the minimum wage because it hasn't been raised since the 60s. And the problem is that companies will not pay more than minimum wage unless they have to. And nobody's had to because nobody's had to try to keep workers. They're perfectly fine with employee turnover. We constantly hear that it's more expensive to hire a new person or rent to a new person than it is to keep an existing one. But that doesn't stop companies. Most companies don't really care. In fact, they prefer the turnover. Because then they can argue that, well, it doesn't make sense to raise wages because we can't count on people anyway. Once again, topic for another time. I digress. So how could it be that my generation and the ones surrounding me, what is it, Gen Z, Gen X, all the gens, everyone pretty much back to the boomers, even the boomers, technically, but nobody had hit the streets begging for work. How could it be? How? I don't blame any one generation for the current economic climate, but certainly it does seem at times that previous generations have wrongly assumed that the ship would just right itself. All they needed to do was raise their children to be hard-working, loyal employees, because they believed the lie too. The companies would eventually reward us with pensions and retirement and decent wages if we just stuck it out long enough, if we were just loyal enough. We just worked hard enough. Somehow their children would find a way to achieve the American dream and grow up and be adults and buy their own houses and have children and get married and be decent, God-fearing Americans with all the odds stacked against them. That medical expenses would and could be surmounted with sheer determination and many credit cards. That we would eventually find a way to have children and buy homes on a wage that ceased to be livable before we were even born. I feel like KB right now. So, where did my peers go? The American dream has long been dead, but we chased it anyway because we were told that it existed and that it mattered. The pandemic opened many of our eyes to an alternative dream. I don't blame any one generation for our current economic climate, but certainly it seems that at times previous generations have wrongly assumed that the ship would just right itself magically one day, that all they needed to do was raise their children to be hardworking, loyal employees, that the companies would eventually reward us with pensions and retirement and decent wages, especially without unions, because, unions are the devil. That's another story. That somehow their children would find a way to achieve the American dream with all the odds stacked against them. That medical expenses could be surmounted with sheer determination and many credit cards. It's the only thing we have. That we would eventually find a way to have children and buy homes on a wage that ceased to be livable before we were even born. But apparently nobody can do math. Or nobody wanted to do math, because here we are. So, where did my peers go? The American dream has long been dead, but we chased it anyway. I'm not saying it's impossible to find a way through. but it is an exception to the rule. The majority did not find a way. The pandemic opened many of our eyes to an alternative dream. We can still be self-sufficient. We can be financially independent. We can be secure. But we're going to have to be able to balance a little bit more. Instead of just getting on a giant ship and sailing across the ocean, we have to be able to have a multiple canoe set up so that we can literally jump from one canoe to the next and hop our way across the ocean. Yeah, we can get there, but we're going to have to think outside the box, right? We can still raise our children without spending half of our income on daycare. We as mothers can be present and engaged and actually personally raise our children. We have 2 generations at least that have been raised by the TV and daycare and strangers and family members, but mostly not by the parents, because a 2-income household was the only way to survive. And even that is doubtful at this point. But it is possible with ingenuity, with couponing, with a reduction of costs everywhere you can, with minimalism, with an increase in multiple revenue streams that just kind of trickle in. But you have to be smart. You can't just do things the way you were taught. We can't just operate on the same rules that our parents did. In fact, they shouldn't have, but they kind of got away with it. We can't. It's not possible anymore. We're just going to be living in apartments with 2 and 3 roommates. And if we have children, we're going to have children, and we're going to barely manage to afford them. And we're going to spend so much in daycare that we may as well have just stayed home and watched the child, because our second income was negated by the daycare costs. There's so much. But we can eat healthy. We can grow gardens in our apartments because we can't afford land. We can't afford houses. It's impossible. There's a shortage of housing because the crash that I lost my job in and all of the housing crisis has affected me still to this day. Now I can't buy a house even if I could, because there aren't any. Or the prices are so terribly inflated. Or maybe the prices aren't inflated, but the wages haven't matched the inflation of the housing costs, so I can't possibly afford a house on my salary, even though the house... What is happening? It's not our fault. We're going to have to try to fix it, and I'm certainly going to try to adjust it before he has to deal with it. But thanks, we have a huge mess because everybody just keeps assuming that it will fix itself. It's not going to fix itself. And we've been living in poverty. A lot of us. There's a few millionaires, billionaires, right? Who made the right guess at the right time. Bitcoin, Facebook, Google. But the majority of people are homeless. Majority of people are living in tents. And yet, a lot of those people, even though they're still working, have finally decided, you know what? We're working really, really hard and we're not getting anywhere and we still can't feed ourselves. Maybe there's a different way. Maybe we can grow food in tiny plastic pots inside our house, inside our car. Maybe we won't have to buy tomatoes. Literally down to reducing the costs that we spend on tomatoes every month. So we can still be self-sufficient. We can still be financially independent. We can raise our children ourselves and potentially have a less mentally deficient generation going forward. Mental health is severely degenerated in the last few decades. And I don't know what's happening, but it's not good. And I think we need to address that because I think that's an epidemic. That's a pandemic. It's a problem. We can still eat healthy. We're just going to have to grow tomatoes in 1 square foot on our kitchen counter. It's completely doable, believe it or not. It really is. We can reduce our overhead costs. We can work from home. We cannot be dependent on a single employer to make the difference. Because, let's face it, it's rare that they do. We can travel the world. You know, I mean, people are living in vans and they're so much happier. People follow seasonal work. People drive across the country and set up camp in parks and recreational areas. And they're so much more able to actually experience this thing that we call life than if they were locked behind their desks or locked into an hour commute. It's living. People are remembering how to live. They're recognizing that the rat race isn't producing any benefits. So either we live now or we don't live at all. We can start businesses without any financial investment. Thank you, Internet, which was invented by us, by the way. So, okay, maybe not my generation, but you know. We can move back to be near family, to be near support systems. Living in cities is really not all it was ever cracked up to be. It isolates you. It strands you. We can live free. But we're going to have to think outside the box. So where did we go? We figured out what really matters. And we're going to do it. Come hell or high water. We're going to do it. Our way. Because your way wasn't working. And we tried it. And we're done. We're going to do it our way now.